Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. Welcome to this last session in our series looking at the trajectory of riba. And as promised, having now outlined the trajectory of riba, we're focusing now on where we are now, and that is the effects of it. And in that regards, I did touch upon how, and to me, this is proof of the prophethood of the Prophet, that he would make such a statement, because it's almost as if we say, ظهر الحكمة, that the wisdom of this statement has become manifest in our time, that the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, would say a time will come when people en masse will be consuming usury or riba. And it will be said, it was asked of him by his companions, it said, is that all of the people? And the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, said, whoever does not take it will be afflicted by its dust. And so many of us choose, and rightly so, we don't want to be part of a usurious dynamic. We don't want to take interest-based loans. We don't want to take interest-based finance. But even in that abstention, or that abstaining from this kind of usurious or cancerous type of economy, we can't escape the fact that money itself, right? And all of us have to deal with money at some point. Money itself, be it the physical money that we hold in our hands, or the bank accounts and what we take to be money, i.e. the digits in our banks, comes into existence as interest-bearing debt. Now, some of you may ask, well, what about Islamic banks? Well, Islamic banks are an imposition in this system. And so Islamic banks, in so much as they're called banks, have to create money in something that looks like an interest-bearing loan. And this is the big paradox, because a lot of the financing mechanisms have to result in a debt creation whereby more money is coming back. And I will probably have to devote a completely different presentation to Islamic banking, what it started off with, what it ended up becoming, and why it ended up becoming, or why it has become what it has. But in essence, if you build up something in an economy or in a logic or in a market that's already been founded on the logic of interest, then don't try and expect anything different. When the Prophet Muhammad first arrived at Medina, he didn't institute the Muslim market in what was already a market present in Medina. There was a market present, and it was owned in a monopolistic way by a specific qabila, Bani Qurayza. And the Prophet said, no, he wouldn't institute the market there, because he wanted to build a fair market. And so instead, he looked for a land that could be given as a trust, that it was endowed to the Muslims. So it was free land that anyone could go and set up a market on. And the market itself had operated on true free trade principles. And so when Islamic banking tries to come in, but it's in a market that's already dominated, and from its contractual, from its expectations, everything with riba, then it will inevitably be co-opted despite the best intents of its practitioners. That doesn't mean that there still isn't a role for it to play, you know, as the lesser of the two evils, as we can say, but it's definitely not, as much as we like calling things Islamic today, we have to think deeper and deeper than so-called Islamic finance. But I'll have to do a separate presentation for that. But in any case, this is where we are today. And this brings me to the definitive verse on the prohibition of riba. This is the verse in the Quran in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 275, and it goes up to 279. And in that it says, الَّذِينَ يَأْكُلُونَ الرِّبَا لَا يَقُومُونَ إِلَّا كَمَا يَقُومُ الَّذِي يَتَخَبَّطُهُ الشَّيْطَانُ مِنَ الْمَسِّ. So it says, بَعْدَ أَعُوذُ بِاللَّهِ مِنَ الشَّيْطَانِ الرَّجِيمِ, that those who consume interest, يَأْكُلُونَ الرِّبَا, cannot stand up except as one who stands being touched by a devilish touch into insanity. Now I've underlined that because sometimes you might think, oh, what does that mean? What is this devilish touch into insanity? And if we just look at a few verses before this verse, right, where it talks about how shaitan deals with people, and we'll find that in the same verse, in the same chapter, Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 268. God says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, بَعْدَ أَعُوذُ بِاللَّهِ مِنَ الشَّيْطَانِ الرَّجِيمِ, He says, الشَّيْطَانُ يَعِدُكُمُ الْفَقْرَ وَيَأْمُرُكُمْ بِالْفَحْشَاءِ وَاللَّهُ يَعِدُكُمْ مَغْفِرَةً مِّنْهُ وَفَضْلًا وَاللَّهُ وَاسِعٌ عَلِيمٌ. That shaitan threatens you with poverty and orders you to immorality, while Allah promises you forgiveness from Him and fadla and a bounty. And God is the all-encompassing and the all-knowing. So it's almost as if this devilish touch into insanity is this kind of sense of, oh no, I'm going to get poor. And then as a result, you get encouraged to become immoral. And very interestingly, this is very, very, very well known, just search this, that they say the markets, the financial markets today are governed by fear and greed. Governed by fear and greed. As if to say the financial markets are governed by this devilish touch, right? That commands you to fear of poverty and brings you to corruption and fahsha and all sorts of immoral things, right? Premised on this fear of anxiety and fear of poverty, right? And so this is the dynamic of riba, and this has now become the dynamic of the financial markets today. And this is why we'll discuss this later, but some economists even think, okay, this is really good, you know, this is, they call this scarcity, the artificial scarcity imported into the economy, because it kind of encourages efficiency in people working and so on. But this is not the Quranic narrative. And so the verse goes on to say, ذلك بأنهم قالوا إنما البيع مثل ربا وأحل الله البيع وحرم الربا. So that is because they say trade is just like interest, right? But God has permitted trade and forbidden interest. And many people don't understand what this verse means. For one, it's showing that trade is very different to interest. These people think trade is like interest, but no. One is a use of money for money, and the other is a use of money for a commodity buying and selling. But it also posits them at different dynamics, because it says trade when it's done properly. And this is when we go back to all of that history we covered, especially using the works of David Graeber, of how the Muslim dimension of trade was premised on mutual aid, on comradeship, on helping, on supporting. But the shaitanic dimension, when it enters with riba, it co-opts trade and turns it into an evil thing, whereby self-interest becomes the most important thing, as long as you can get away with it, and this morality fabric gets stripped off. So it's not just saying trade is different, but they're saying they exist at opposite spectrums. But if you join them together, then you get a distortion of trade itself. Now it's interesting how many people, when they say, we don't want free trade, we want fair trade. We don't want a trade that monopolizes and brings more and more money into the benefits of that increasingly receding number of corporations and their elites, right, that govern the global world economy. We don't want that trade. But why is free trade now being polarized and people say they want fair trade? Because the way freedom of free trade is operating in a globalistic or neo-global type economy, globalized economy, within a ribawi, within a capitalistic dimension, or capitalism as defined by interest, right? Then this is the freedom for oppression. This is the freedom for those who own the capital to oppress the others who don't. Whereas a true model of free trade would be the model of free trade that the Muslims embodied. And they were the pioneers of true free trade, because the first thing they did is to get interest out, and to get all these monopolistic tendencies out, and to revere the role of the honest and just merchant, the honest and just trader. And then that what evolves is a very different dimension of trade. And so the Quran, so it goes on to say, the Quran goes on to say, فمن جاء موعظة من ربه فانتهى فله ما سلف وأمره إلى الله ومن عاد فأولئك أصحاب النار هم فيها خالدون. He says, so whomsoever receives an admonition from his Lord and desists, then he is past, his affair is what he's got, that he may have what is past, but his affair rests with God, right? But someone who returns to dealing in interest and usury, and these are the people who are perdition, and they will abide therein forever. Not just in the next life when there is justice, ultimate justice being served, but also this perdition of the heart, a heart that doesn't find its contentment in God. Right? And then this is a beautiful verse, and this is what Allah says, يَمْحَقُ اللَّهُ الرِّبَا وَيُرْبِ الصَّدَقَاتِ. Allah says, God says, He destroys riba and gives growth to charity. And what's really beautiful, and I had this whole live stream interview with Dr. Sahel Hanif on this, is that the root used for yurbi, gives growth, is the same root of interest, rabwa, right? But here it's yamhaqullahu riba. This is a destructive growth. Interest has a destructive growth, but sadaqat or charity has a constructive growth. And this itself is an allusion to how do we fight riba. We have to enter into a degrowth dynamic of this ribawi growth, and we have to enter into a growth dynamic of true growth, which is growth of hearts, growth of bonds, growth of spirit, right? It can manifest in a growth of more money, but true growth is this growth of connectedness, growth of oneness, growth of recognition of who we are. And that's why God says He gives growth to charity, right? And how many times you do something genuinely for the good of another person, and it comes back to you in ways that you can't even calculate. It's not the interest-based calculation of fixed returns, but it comes back to you in a way of greatness. This is the spirit of the gift, because your own life is a gift. You're being given things freely and unreturned and undeserved. And that's why God says, "Man yuqrid Allah qardan hasana." Who will give a goodly loan to God, right? Goodly loan. A goodly loan of what? Of the very existence He's given you. He's giving you this existence. And so give back your gratitude to Him thereby, right? And so it says later, this is, we go to this one of the last verses in this, it says, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا اتَّقُوا اللَّهَ وَذَرُوا مَا بَقِيَ مِنَ الرِّبَا إِن كُنتُم مُؤْمِنِينَ. It says, "O you who believe, fear God and give up what remains of interest if you are believers. فَإِن لَمْ تَفْعَلُوا فَأْذَنُوا بِحَرْبٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ فَإِن تُبْتُمْ فَلَكُمْ رُؤُوسِ أَمْوَالِكُمْ لَا تَظْلِمُونَ وَلَا تُظْلَمُونَ." And if you do not, then beware or informed of a war against God from God and His messenger. Now, there's nowhere in the Quran where there is this dire warning of war from God and His messenger. And somebody once asked me, he said, why would God declare war on anyone? God's all powerful, it just needs to. Yeah, that's the point of this verse, because it means that you're not going to win. You're not going to win. And the reason why you have elicited this response, this divine response, that you're going to be smashed, is because you are declaring war against God yourself by dealing with usury. Thomas Hobbes famously said that the war of people is a war of all against all. This is how people deal with money if it wasn't for state intervention. He's right to a degree in an interest-based dynamic. As long as you are premised on self-interest, then you will seek the war of all against all. You will seek the war of all against all. And that's why what's very, very important is that if you are premised in this dynamic, then you are bringing about this kind of destruction of the world. So give up interest, as God says, give up interest. وَذَرُوا مَا بَقِيَ مِنَ الرِّبَا. Give it up if you truly are those who believe. Where is your belief if you're busy dealing with interest? Where is your belief if you don't get it up to now, right? Right? But if you don't get it, know that it's not going to work for you. It's not going to work for you in this world, and it definitely won't work for you where you're going to end up in the next world, right? وَإِن تُبْتُمْ. But if you repent, فَلَكُمْ رُؤُوسِ أَمْوَالِكُمْ. You may keep your capital. لَا تُظْلِمُونَ وَلَا تُظْلَمُونَ. Do not oppress and you will not be oppressed. Some people try to apply a kind of a loose interpretation to this, saying, oh, they wanted to do what the Protestant Reformation did to Christianity, and what other people basically say, oh no, it's not usury per se, it's just the degree of usury you use. So as long as it's not an oppressive usury, and it brings you back to that subjective sense of what's oppressive and what's not, go back to any single original commentary on this verse, and you will find the translation or the understanding of la tuzlamun wa la tazlimun wa la tuzlamun, do not oppress and you will not be oppressed, is understood as that very amount that you take over the capital, over the Ra's al-Mal. Because you can keep your principle, but it says oppress not and you'll not be oppressed. This is the excess above the principle. In other words, that degree of interest that you take is the oppression. That degree, be it whatever degree you take, is the oppression here. So what a powerful verse. And this brings us back to, we can see that verse being lived out today. We can see this verse being lived out today. This is the dust of interest being lived out today. Firstly, all of money comes into existence, mostly through commercial banks, in a form of artificial scarcity. There never is enough to pay the banks. And so this brings this competition, and this brings this devilish touch of fear and greed. Because why are you fearful? Because there isn't enough money to go by. And why does this bring a selfish dynamic? Why? Because it's deliberately been designed like that. It destroys trade. Allah says what he says. They say trade is just like interest, but trade isn't like interest. But when you put interest in, it destroys trade. Much of what is bought and sold. We already spoke about how money has started cannibalizing itself. It's become more of a global casino than global trade. Much of what 98 to 99% of what's being bought is on the derivatives market and positions on capital and forex trading. That is basically open speculation. And look at that. This results in systemic booms and busts. But more than that, it's resulting in a monetization of the world, that we're converting more and more of what is the commonwealth of this world, from its forests, from its trees in the forest, from the oceans, from the natural wildlife, to every single thing we're converting into money. Because as long as it's not in money, then it's not adding to the GDP, it's not adding to the growth imperative in an economy. And so if we see a natural rainforest, we can't appreciate the natural diversity. We can't appreciate the wonder of what that's providing to our tapestry. Instead, the imperative, the growth imperative says, deforest the rainforest and plant a monoculture plantation of what, palm trees or whatever, palm oil that can produce palm oil. And then that can go into, providing these things that we can use and sell in these various types of objects of commerce that we trade. But hang on, before that, the lumber never added to growth. It wasn't, as long as it stayed this rich ecosystem of diversity, it wasn't adding to growth. But now that we've deforested, it does. And this is the logic that's leading to the depleting of the aquifers. This is the logic that's leading to mass scale agricultural farming. This is the logic that's resulting in all of our food industry being dominated in the hands of increasingly receding elite. I mean, Monsanto controls so much of the agriculture industry. And you can look at the reason why much of chicken is in the way it operates today. Much of fish is being, poisoned by mercury. Much of cattle. Well, because this kind of mass scale commercial agro-farming business is once again part of this imperative of growth. Then there's wealth polarization. Right? I remember a while ago, there was a book that was brought out by saying, I think it was by Russell Brand, talking about how if you could put 250 of the richest people in a bus, and some of these double-decker buses could take that many number of people, then they would have half the world's wealth, right, of the entire world. And that's probably only got more polarized now, because the nature of this thing is to increase polarization, which is why Citibank had this kind of a leaked memo whereby they kind of forecast that the future of this world is this kind of oligopoly type of premise, that the only people that will matter will be this financial elite class, right? But is this the kind of world we want? Is this the kind of world we want, where endemic poverty, world poverty, is being instilled by the financial system itself? And of course, we've already touched upon ecological destruction. And this one other thing that is often not known is, while this money starts circulating in the economy, then it has to go to our assets. And one of the dominant assets we have is property. And that is how it survives, because the system has to survive in making you indebted. Because if you're not indebted, then they're not able to produce more money. And so a lot of the dominant assets that we need and we take, such as a home, they're being inflated by the bank lending, not anything else, not by supposed supply and demand outside of it. The primary driver is the bank lending itself. And this chart demonstrates this. Look at the rocketing of like house prices. And look at this is the highest prices, right? This is the lending on dwelling, right? And look at, the actual stock has not really increased, nor has the population. So it's not supply and demand, right? It's actually the house prices are directly proportional. It's a direct relationship connected to the lending on the dwellings, right? And look at how much mortgage payments is the average take home. Increasingly, we're becoming indebted through houses. I mean, mortgage literally means a death grip, right? But increasingly, how many of us can even buy a house in the West, right? In other parts of the world, and the idea is to indebt you for life. In America, they'll indebt you for life through your student fees. If not, they'll indebt you for life through a house. And you just live your life paying off your debts. But you see, that's how the system works. Because at its macro level, America is the most indebted country in the world. How is that even possible? It's meant to be the richest country in the world. Well, the only way it's possible if you understand that money itself comes into existence as a debt. Right? And so this system distributes the money from the bottom 90% to the top 10%. This is what Margaret Kennedy spoke about. She wrote a book about interest as well. So this kind of system operates. It transfers money from the real economy to the bank economy, or the phantom economy. Right? What's the real economy? Real assets, real goods, real people. But then if you look, and this is something David Corton has spoken about, of how increasingly the financialization of capital means what's being bought and sold is nothing. It's just positions on money, the phantom economy. But in some way, this mysterious connection, the real economy is constantly being used to supplement this financial economy, which takes the most, which basically is who are the beneficiaries of this system. So is there a conspiracy? There's no need for a conspiracy. This is the system itself, right? Many studies have been published and said majority of the world wealth is controlled by 150 corporations, of which the top 49 are all connected to the financial services. This is in the Forbes and New Scientist magazine. We've already covered environmental impact, right? This is the major cause of global warming as well. Right? And we can see that in the top emissions of this so-called system. So, and I've already spoken about a lot of this. I spoke about the role of multinational corporations, the role of the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO. But we have to understand that this is a type of, as I said, a second wave of colonization. So what are the solutions? Now, one of the solutions are to increasingly bring things back to the real economy. And part of this, and I'm not an absolute advocate, I'm not saying gold is the only solution, but to bring things back to trade, right, within the bullion fabric, but also commodities. So there's some really interesting people out there who speak about commodity basket currencies, producing currencies that are pegged to commodities. I mean, there's also a use of gold accounting. So in trade, we can use gold as a measure, a store of. So gold accounting in bilateral trade, I would refer people to the works of Dr. Ahmed Kamal Maidin Mira from Malaysia. And he speaks a lot about how we don't need to necessarily have gold in terms of the physical gold, as long as we use that as a unit of measure and a reference. So it enables accounting to happen in bilateral trade. Another proposal that's often given is the idea of 100% reserve banking. And this was actually the proposal of the Chicago school itself, right? The famous Chicago school, which that the money stock should not depend on the decisions of bankers who simply see lending opportunities as a profit imperative, but should be stable stock that's determined by gold and silver and other commodities, right? And so they don't necessarily, this system doesn't reject financial intermediation through a banking system, but instead of proposing it through commercial banks, it proposes a two-tier system, whereby there is a depository system with 100% money. This is, I refer people to the writings of Irving Fisher, and a profit-making initiative, which is more investment banking, where this is kind of going out and actually investing in initiatives. And so in such a financial system, the deposit-taking institutions operate on a 100% reserve system. And so there's no fractional reserve. And there's no deposit-taking institutions, rather the profit is on risk and return sharing. And so this is similar to, so this was the Chicago plan, and you can see some other, people and Muslims have kind of taken this on as well. Sometimes they call it binary economics or capital homesteading. So these are the initiatives to be looked at. But you can see all of these things are returning back to the idea of the real economy. One of the things that I would say, I know a lot of people speaking about Bitcoin, I would once again refer people to a presentation by Ahmed Kamaldeen Mira. He's got a presentation on Facebook, which is called Cryptocurrencies from an Islamic Perspective. So in that, he discusses the case of Bitcoin, and then he discusses where there are issues that could arise from a Sharia perspective. But these issues are correctable, right? One of the issues being it's not, Bitcoin is not backed by anything, any real sense of commodities or service, and so that's why it's volatile. But if we could have a cryptocurrency that is now backed by something solid, like a basket of commodities or gold, this could be something very useful. And also now there are issues with, the claims of Bitcoins, is the whole so-called anonymity, or, what happens in terms of security, things like that. And so the main problem in Bitcoin is the excessive uncertainty. We call this ghara. But there are other alternatives, kind of asset-backed cryptocurrencies. And so this is one of the things that Ahmed Kamaldeen and Mira is looking at. And so another thing I want to point people to is the relocalization in the sense of community. Now, the dynamic between riba is to constantly make this sense of anonymity, that we're not responsible, we're not taking responsibility for our neighbors, for our people. And the dynamic of zakat, which I had a big discussion with Dr. Sahel on, and that really is the dynamic of even our trade, is to relocalize and to bring a sense of connection. Doesn't, even if we're operating on a long scale distances, but there has to be a sense of connection. And this is one of the things I would refer people to research the sense of the Islamic gift economy, especially by someone called Dr. Adi Setia. And so there are many things that can be done. There has to be degrowth activism. There has to be greater localization. There has to be efficient use of B2B, P2P economics. B2B is business to business. P2P is person to person or portal to portal. Basically, what it's intending is that we are bringing about a sense of autonomy of people to people interacting with each other. We need to revisit and bring about open trade markets. Currently, our markets are monopolistic. They are geared towards artificial diversity and supporting the corporations who inevitably, in the words of Noam Chomsky, they kind of form an oligopoly, and they usually resolve around three or four corporations that control each market. And we want to get out of this. We want to have genuinely open markets, which involve, to go back to the Muslim idea of ensuring that there is general open trade, that there are no monopolistic lines in both the supply and distribution. And the first thing is to get rid of interest, right? And so we need to revive more awqaf, guilds, and crafts. And this connects communities, but also brings about a preservation of the earth. And if we go back to the idea that the commons are being privatized and monetized, then we need to bring more of the commons back into the common fabric. We need to bring more of the land and the resources and the community back into the common fabric where it's serving the community. And we find this in the prophetic example, like he would institute hima, like protective green belts. He would ensure that there are certain things that cannot be privatized, that if they do, then there is equivalent of a tax that should be paid back to the community. A lot of this mirrors what Henry George would come about with years later called the single land tax, except that it's applied to so many other things. We have all of these vehicles that we can use. Another vehicle is the community land trust, which is very much like the awqaf, but applied to land, rooting communities, rooting them. And of course, last but not least, I want to mention the importance of permaculture, revisiting traditional agricultural methods that would ensure a permanent dimension of agriculture, because a lot of modern day mass farming and commercial agriculture is destroying the land and destroying our resources. So all of these are ways we can combat riba. And I think a lot of us will be driven to these ways because the current economy is not looking very good. And one of the things is, if the dollar finally collapses, the hyperinflation happens, then it will affect almost all our currencies, unless a competitor like China comes and steps up and takes over and becomes the global currency. Or what could be proposed is, mass digital banking, where now everything becomes decentralized, or could be centralized but through banks now, or one global currency. All of these things are being proposed, but the point is that we have to always operate with a dynamic that brings us back to connection, brings us back to gratitude, brings us back to using our money for the sake of what it was intended. These are some of the books I've used throughout this presentation. I did use David Graeber's book quite a lot, and I do recommend his writings. In a personal sense, he is an anarchist, and he did play a big role in this kind of the Occupy Wall Street movement. But beyond his political views, I think his writings are of a very high standard, and that's why he's teaching a financial anthropology, is an anthropologist at London School of Economics. They won't employ him otherwise. The second person, once again, politically, I wouldn't agree with Niall Ferguson, especially other aspects of his personal life, but his Ascent of Money is a very good book, and he himself is academically very qualified, Harvard and lecturers, and he's got a very good BBC, I think it was a BBC documentary on the same title. The next is a couple of my books are from one of my favorite authors, Charles Eisenstein. I really connected with his writings because I saw effectively what he was articulating was the Islamic dimension on money, but it was kind of done very well in this paradigm of how a lot of things are interconnected, and money is a conduit for human relations, and increasing there's a trajectory of separation. And when separation happens, this is being played out in the way we see our sciences, our knowledge, but especially in the sense of money. And he talks about ways that we can reintegrate ourselves. Also, Richard Heinberg's book, The End of Growth, is very important. I've got a few writings of my own. There's one which is just an unpublished kind of draft. It's on the internet. It's called The Way of Return. But my book, which is published, is called The Way of Return, Responding to Economic Environmental Justice with Wisdom Teachings of Islam. So I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. We want to strive to removing this dust of riba, but the key word here is community, because we have to recognize there is a sense of a commonwealth. Commonwealth literally means a common well-being, a wealth of value with each other. But most importantly, we have to find our value through being with Allah, being through God. Many of the great spiritual luminaries of Islam said that there's one verse that stands out that highlights how we should interact with this world. And it says, if you can find your need through God, then he will free you and give you a wealth that frees you from all else besides. So we used to reestablish our connection to God, and that involves reestablishing our connection to mankind, being the stewards on earth, and that also involves how we deal with our money. So with this, we come to an end of this presentation. We hope you've enjoyed it. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته سبحانك وبحمدك سبحان العظيم والعصر إن الإنسان في خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.